There are days when everything goes according to plan, when you can predict the end of the day with the precision of a TV guide. Then there are days that laugh in your face, slap you around, and send you reeling into a world of confusion. That Friday night was definitely the latter. I just finished one of the longest weeks of my life at the station. Nothing like covering a local election with a side of budget cuts and cranky interviewees to leave a man utterly drained. All I wanted was to sit on the couch with a frozen pizza, flip through Netflix, and slowly let my brain melt into oblivion. Nothing too ambitious, just a quiet night alone to recharge. As I stepped into my apartment, I immediately noticed something was off. At first, it was just a gut feeling, but then I saw it, a scarf on the floor. Not mine, obviously, and not Emily's either. At least, I didn't think it was hers. She had good taste, usually going for sleek, expensive-looking accessories. This thing looked like it came from the clearance bin at the local dollar store. I picked it up, frowning. Why would Emily have this? Did she get a new one? Whatever. I brushed it off. After 4 years together, I had stopped pretending to understand the mysteries of women's fashion. I headed toward the bedroom, eager to surprise her. I could already picture her laughing at the tired look on my face, offering some sarcastic comment about how I needed to live a little. Maybe we'd order takeout and have one of those rare nights where we both actually had time to sit down and talk. We hadn't had one of those in a while. The closer I got to the bedroom, the more I heard sounds that shouldn't have been there. You know how when you walk into a room and the air just feels wrong? That's what hit me as I reached for the doorknob. And when I opened it, well, let's just say I wasn't prepared for what was on the other side. There, tangled in the sheets that we picked out together, was Emily and someone else. A guy. I didn't know him, but from the looks of it, he was very comfortable, very at home. My brain didn't immediately register what I was seeing. It was like my body had shut down the part of me that should have been screaming, raging, or at least doing something. Instead, I just stood there, numb, as if I'd walked into the wrong scene in someone else's life. For years of late-night talks, planning vacations we never took, dreaming about the future. For years of everything reduced to this. I didn't say a word. What was there to say? It was all there, clear as day, and no amount of yelling was going to change it. Without a sound, I turned around, walked back out of the apartment, and shut the door behind me. The moment I stepped outside, the numbness started to wear off, and the weight of it all hit me like a truck. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just got in my car and drove, the same way you might drive after getting terrible news at the doctor's office. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. I wasn't ready to face what had just happened. Not yet. The car seemed to drive itself as I sped down the empty streets, headlights cutting through the dark like a knife through thick fog. My mind was a blur, replaying the scene over and over again. Emily. That guy. The sheets. Our sheets. It was like my brain was stuck on repeat, unable to process the reality that had just hit me like a sledgehammer. I kept driving, not sure where I was going, just knowing I couldn't stay in that apartment. The one place that was supposed to be safe, supposed to be home, now felt like enemy territory. It didn't matter where I went as long as it was far from there. Before I even realized it, I found myself heading toward the cliffs, the same spot I always went to when things got rough. The ocean had always been my escape. The roar of the waves, the endless horizon. It made my problems feel small, like they could be washed away with the tide. It was one of the only places where I could get some peace after coming back from the war. The cliffs were empty tonight, just the way I liked them. I parked the car, got out, and leaned against the railing, staring out at the blackness stretching before me. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below, matching the storm brewing inside me. Betrayal. It was a word I had never associated with Emily. I thought we had something solid, something unshakable. Sure, we had our ups and downs. What couple didn't? But I never doubted her. I trusted her, believed in her. Now all of that was gone, swept away by the tide of her actions. The thing that hurt the most wasn't even the fact that she had cheated. It was the realization that she had been living a lie. For how long? Had I missed the signs? Had I been too wrapped up in my own struggles to notice what was happening right under my nose? My mind wandered back to the war. It was strange how betrayal felt eerily similar to the fear I felt back then. Only this time, the enemy wasn't out there, somewhere on the battlefield. It was right here in my own home, sharing my bed. For a brief moment, I considered just getting back in the car and driving off the edge of the cliff. Just let gravity do the work, let the pain disappear in an instant. But that moment passed quickly. It wasn't in me to give up, not like this. Not over her. She wasn't worth it. Instead, I stayed there for what felt like hours. letting the cold wind whip through my hair, trying to clear my head. The temptation to let go was strong, but my stubbornness was stronger. I wasn't going to let this break me. Not yet. Eventually, I got back in the car and headed to the only other place I could think of, Josh's bar. My sanctuary, my refuge, where I knew I could count on a friend who wouldn't ask too many questions. Josh had been my best friend since high school, long before the military, before Emily, before life got complicated. He'd always been the guy who could handle whatever you threw at him, and right now I needed someone who could handle me. Josh's bar was more than just a place to grab a drink. It was a haven, a dimly lit, hole-in-the-wall kind of place where regulars could quietly nurse their beers without the burden of small talk. No neon signs, no fancy cocktails. It wasn't even listed on Yelp, and that's exactly what I needed. When I pulled up to the bar, it was nearly midnight, and the place was practically empty. Perfect. I stumbled inside, feeling the weight of the evening hanging over me like a wet blanket. Josh was behind the bar, wiping down glasses, his usual stoic expression greeting me. He looked up when I entered, and without a word, he knew. He always knew. "Rough night?" he asked, raising an eyebrow as he set down a glass. His voice was casual, but there was an undercurrent of concern. I didn't respond right away. I just sat down at the bar and gave him a look that said it all. He didn't need details. The details would come later. Right now, all I needed was the bottle. Without missing a beat, he slid over a tumbler of bourbon neat. He knew my drink, and he knew when to keep his mouth shut. I took a long, slow sip, letting the burn of the alcohol numb the raw edges of my mind. For a few moments, we sat in silence. The only sound, the faint clink of glasses and the low hum of some forgotten blues song playing in the background. Finally, Josh broke the silence. "You want to talk about it?" I stared at the amber liquid in my glass, swirling it around like it held the answers to my life's problems. "I came home and found her with another guy," I said, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "In our bed." Josh didn't flinch. He didn't gasp or widen his eyes like most people might. He just nodded, like this was something you could expect in life, something you weather through like a storm. "Damn," he muttered, pouring himself a glass now too. "That's tough." Tough didn't begin to cover it, but I appreciated his understatement. He wasn't about to throw pity at me, and that's why I was here. Pity was the last thing I needed. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, taking a sip. "No idea," I said, staring at the bar top. "Long enough for it to feel like I'm the last one to know." I felt the sting of those words, like admitting it out loud made it more real. Josh just shook his head, leaning back against the shelves of liquor behind him. "People are crap sometimes, man." "Yeah," I agreed, staring into my drink. "They are." And so, we sat there, not saying much. Just two guys who'd seen their fair share of life's darker sides, silently acknowledging that betrayal, no matter how personal, was just another part of the human condition. As the hours dragged on, I kept drinking and Josh kept pouring. We didn't talk much about Emily after that first exchange. Instead, we talked about old times, dumb things we did in high school, the glory days of Friday night football games, the time we road tripped to Vegas and got stuck in the desert. Anything but the train wreck that was my life at that moment. It helped at least a little. The memories distracted me, pushed away the image of Emily with that guy, pushed away the ache in my chest. By the time the bar closed, I was well past the point of feeling anything. Emotionally and physically numb, I could barely stand up. Josh grabbed my truck keys off the counter before I could even think about leaving. "You're not driving," he said firmly, but not unkindly. "You're crashing at my place. Guest room's ready." I didn't argue. Hell, I didn't have the energy to. I stumbled into the guest room, collapsing onto the bed without bothering to take off my shoes. Sleep came fast, but not peacefully. When I woke up the next morning, it felt like someone had taken a hammer to my skull. My mouth was dry as a desert, and every muscle in my body ached like I'd gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight. The smell of stale whiskey clung to my clothes, and my brain was swimming in a fog of regret and lingering numbness. I groaned, sitting up in the unfamiliar guest room, trying to piece together the events of the night before. And then it hit me, Emily. The betrayal. The guy. The bed. All of it came rushing back in a sickening wave. I wasn't ready to deal with that just yet. But of course, life doesn't care about what you're ready for. My phone, which had somehow ended up on the nightstand next to me, buzzed loudly, cutting through the silence like a siren. I picked it up, squinting at the screen. It was an unknown number, and normally I'd let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. Maybe it was the leftover paranoia from last night, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that things were about to get worse. "Hello." My voice was rough, still thick with the remnants of too much bourbon and too little sleep. Is this Matt Wallace? The voice on the other end was official, clipped. Not the kind of voice you want to hear when you're already feeling like death warmed over. Yeah, I replied, a sinking feeling settling in my gut. This is Officer Harper with the California Highway Patrol. We've been trying to reach you. Trying to reach me? Why? I rubbed my face, trying to shake off the fog. What's this about? There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that tells you whatever comes next isn't going to be good. I'm sorry to inform you that there's been an accident. A vehicle went off the cliffs last night, near the old coastal road. 2 passengers, a male and a female. Both deceased. The words hit me like a punch in the chest, but it was the next part that knocked the wind out of me. The female has been identified as Emily Harris. We believe she was your partner. The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of the bed, trying to keep myself anchored to reality. Emily. Gone? It didn't make sense. She was in our bed with him, with that guy. My mouth went dry as sandpaper, and I could barely get the words out. Who was the guy? Benjamin Ross, the officer replied. We're still investigating the circumstances, but it appears their car went off the cliff at high speed. It's unclear whether it was an accident or something else. I didn't say anything for a long time. My mind couldn't process what I was hearing. Emily and Ben were dead. They'd gone off the same cliffs I'd been standing on just hours before. And now they were gone. Mr. Wallace? Officer Harper's voice cut through the haze. We'll need you to come down to the station to provide a statement when you're able. I know this is a difficult time, but we'll need your cooperation. I managed a grunt of acknowledgement before hanging up. My hand, still clutching the phone, fell to my side as I sat there, staring at nothing. What were they doing? Fleeing? Were they feeling guilty? Were they running from something? From me? Or had it been some kind of tragic accident? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them making any sense. How could it all go so wrong, so fast? I heard a knock on the door, and Josh peeked his head in, his face concerned. You good? I shook my head slowly, the shock still settling in. Emily's dead, Josh. Her, and that guy, Ben. They went off the cliffs last night. Josh didn't say anything for a long moment, just stepped into the room and sat down next to me, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with quiet seriousness. Damn, he muttered under his breath. Man, I don't even know what to say. Neither did I. What was there to say? I sat there, replaying the officer's words in my head. Was it an accident? Or was it something else? Something darker? That was the moment when the guilt and paranoia started creeping in. What if I had stayed? What if I had confronted them instead of walking away? Would they still be alive? But here's the thing about guilt. It doesn't need logic to latch onto your mind. And paranoia? Well, that's its ugly cousin. Together, they can turn a bad situation into a waking nightmare. Josh didn't say much, just kept me company as I sat there, turning everything over in my head. It was like I'd entered a different dimension, one where time moved slowly, and the normal rules of reality didn't apply. I couldn't stop replaying the events from the night before, wondering what their last moments had been like. Were they arguing? Did they see the edge coming? Or had it all happened too fast for either of them to understand what was happening? I've got to go, I finally muttered, standing up on unsteady legs. Josh looked up at me, his expression a mix of concern and hesitation. Go where? To the cliffs. To see. I don't know. Something. I wasn't even sure what I was saying. I just knew I had to see it with my own eyes, had to understand how it all went down. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. Josh called after me, but I was already halfway out, the cold morning air slapping me in the face like a wake-up call. The drive to the cliffs felt longer than usual. Every minute stretched out as my mind churned. When I finally pulled up to the site, there was already a police presence. Yellow tape, flashing lights, and a few officers milling about, talking quietly among themselves. The wreckage had been cleared, but you could still see the tire marks leading off the edge, the deep grooves in the dirt telling the final story of how fast they must have been going. I stood there, staring at the spot where they'd plunged to their deaths. My mind couldn't stop racing. Was it an accident? Did Ben lose control of the car? Or had something else pushed them over the edge? Something darker? What if they'd been arguing? What if they knew I was nearby, at the cliffs, and panicked? The questions kept swirling in my head, each one more paranoid than the last. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Emily hadn't been entirely innocent in all of this. What if she'd known about more than just the affair? What if she was part of something bigger, something that had pushed them both to this tragic end? It didn't make sense, of course, But grief and betrayal don't exactly lend themselves to rational thinking. Mr. Wallace? I turned to see Officer Harper, the one who had called me earlier, walking toward me. His face was serious but not unkind. I didn't expect you to come down here, he said, glancing at the cliff's edge. It's a lot to take in. I needed to see it, I replied, my voice hollow. I needed to understand. He nodded, as if he'd heard the same thing 1,000 times before. I get it, but there's not much to see now. The investigation's still ongoing, but it looks like it was just an accident. High speed, lost control, went off the edge. Nothing more. Nothing more. That's what they always said when they didn't want to dig deeper. But I wasn't convinced. Was there anything strange? I asked, my voice lower, hesitant. Anything that doesn't add up? Officer Harper raised an eyebrow. Strange? Like what? I shrugged, feeling ridiculous even asking, but the paranoia wouldn't let go. I don't know. Emily, she wouldn't just do something like this. It doesn't make sense. Was she running from something? Was Ben involved in something? I mean, what were they even doing on the cliffs? The officer looked at me carefully, taking a moment before he answered. Look, I can't speculate on the details, but from what we've gathered so far, it seems like a case of bad judgment. Late night, speeding, maybe even arguing in the car. We'll get the full report soon, but right now, there's no evidence of foul play. I nodded, but it didn't ease the knot in my stomach. I thanked him and walked back to my car, feeling no closer to answers than when I'd arrived. As I drove away from the cliffs, that nagging paranoia clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye, and no amount of police reports or logical explanations would change that. The paranoia gnawed at me, refusing to loosen its grip. Even after leaving the cliffs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't believe the whole just an accident story. It felt too convenient, too clean, especially considering who Ben was. Someone I barely knew, but whose presence had managed to completely unravel my life in a matter of hours. A few days passed, and I holed up in my apartment, avoiding work and ignoring calls. The world outside continued spinning, but I was stuck, suspended in a purgatory of unanswered questions. Josh checked in on me a few times, bringing food, beer, and his quiet understanding. He knew better than to push me, letting me ride out the storm in my own time. But then, something happened that dragged me out of that self-imposed isolation. A letter. An actual, old-fashioned letter, delivered by mail, slipped through my front door like a ghost from the past. It was from Ben's mother. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, my heart thudding in my chest. What could she possibly want? Condolences? Apologies? I wasn't sure I had the energy to deal with either. But curiosity got the better of me, and eventually I ripped it open and started reading. The letter was long, detailed. Ben's mom wasn't just reaching out to express her sympathy. She had something to confess. Apparently, Ben had been hiding more than just his affair with Emily. According to her, my cheating partner wasn't even Ben's first. He'd had a long history of infidelity, stretching back years, ruining his marriage to Lindsay and breaking her trust again and again. I knew nothing about Lindsay, just a name whispered in the chaos of Emily's death. But this letter painted a dark picture of Ben, a man who had been tangled up in one affair after another, spinning lies so thick you'd need a chainsaw to cut through them. And Emily? She was just the latest in a long line of women he had pulled into his web of deception. The letter didn't stop there, though. It got worse. Ben wasn't just a serial cheater. He had also been involved in some shady business dealings, specifically gambling. Big debts, the kind that don't just disappear when you ignore them. His mother hinted at the possibility that those debts might have followed him to the grave, and that maybe, just maybe, those debts were connected to the accident that took both their lives. I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a boulder. So, this wasn't just about betrayal. This wasn't just about Emily and Ben having an affair behind my back. This was about a man who had been playing with fire for years, and Emily had gotten caught in the flames. Suddenly, things started clicking into place. The reckless driving, the cliffside crash. It wasn't just two people running from their guilt. It might have been something darker. Retribution. Someone settling a score with Ben. And Emily had just been collateral damage. But that brought a whole new flood of questions. Did Emily know about Ben's other life? Was she involved? Or had she been just another pawn in whatever twisted game he was playing? I didn't know. I couldn't know. And that made it all the worse. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had loved for 4 years, was suddenly a stranger. A stranger who might have been involved in things I couldn't even begin to understand. The paranoia came back, this time with a vengeance. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was Emily just another victim, like me? Or was she complicit in all of this? Had she known what Ben was really like? And if so, why hadn't she told me? Why had she gone along with it? That's when I decided I needed answers. And the only person who could give them to me was Ben's wife, Lindsay. I found her contact information in the letter, a postscript at the bottom. Ben's mom had mentioned that Lindsay might want to talk, that she might need to speak to someone who had been in the same position. It was a strange offer, but right now I needed to understand. So I picked up the phone, and for the first time since the accident, I reached out to someone who might actually give me the answers I was looking for. The first thing that hit me when Lindsay answered the door was how tired she looked. Not physically. She was well put together. Her dark hair neatly tied back, makeup barely smudged, but there was something in her eyes. They were hollow, like she hadn't really slept in weeks, maybe months. And I knew that look. I'd seen it every time I caught a glimpse of my own reflection. We stood there in awkward silence for a moment, neither of us really knowing how to start. After all, what do you say to someone whose life was wrecked by the same man who wrecked yours? Matt, right? She finally asked, her voice quiet but steady. Come in? I stepped into her house, and it was immediately clear that this was a place once full of life. There were family photos on the walls, pictures of her and Ben on vacations, laughing, holding hands, looking like the perfect couple. It made me feel sick just looking at them. I'm not really sure what to say, Lindsay said as she led me to the living room. This is weird, right? Weird didn't even begin to cover it, but I nodded. Yeah, a little. We sat down, the awkwardness between us growing thicker by the second. I wasn't sure how to start this conversation. I didn't come here to bond over shared misery, but we were tied together by it, whether we liked it or not. So I started rubbing my hands together. I don't even know where to begin. Your mother-in-law sent me a letter. About Ben. About everything. Lindsay's face tightened at the mention of his name. She told me she was going to reach out to you. I wasn't sure you'd want to talk. I almost didn't, I admitted, leaning back in my seat. But after what she told me about Ben, I don't know, I needed to know if it was true. If everything she said was true. Lindsay's eyes dropped to the floor. Most of it is, she said quietly. The affairs, the gambling, the debts, it's all true. I didn't realize how much I had needed to hear that. To know that it wasn't just in my head, that Ben really had been leading some double life, and Emily, whether willingly or not, had been dragged into it. Lindsay sighed deeply, leaning back on the couch, her expression a mix of exhaustion and bitterness. I knew about the affairs for a long time. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but there were always signs. You know how it is, right? You try to ignore it, push it aside, tell yourself you're overthinking things. But deep down, you always know. I nodded. I knew that feeling too well. Yeah, I guess I didn't want to see it either. I was ready to leave him, she continued, her voice picking up strength. But then he promised he'd change, promised he'd stop. And I wanted to believe him. For a while, it seemed like maybe he had. But then, well, you know how that turned out? Emily was just one of many, huh? I asked, the bitterness creeping into my voice despite my attempt to stay neutral. Lindsay gave a sad smile. It looks like it. And now we're here trying to figure out what the hell just happened. We sat there for a while, both of us staring at the floor, letting the weight of everything settle in. It was strange, sitting there with the widow of the man who had not only destroyed her life, but also shattered mine. But there was a weird kind of understanding between us. A shared pain. A bond built from the ruins of what Ben and Emily had done. Do you think it was an accident? I asked finally, breaking the silence. The crash, I mean. Lindsay hesitated, biting her lip. Honestly, I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out since the police called me. He wasn't just cheating. He was involved with people you don't want to owe money to. Dangerous people. The kind that don't just let things slide. The paranoia that had been gnawing at me since the accident flared up again. You think they were after him? You think the crash wasn't just some random thing? She shrugged, looking down at her hands. I don't know, Matt, but I do know that Ben was in over his head. And if Emily was with him, her voice trailed off, but I didn't need her to finish the sentence. If Emily had gotten caught up in Ben's mess, then it wasn't just an affair that had killed her. It was something far darker, something neither of us had seen coming. What do we do now? I asked, feeling more lost than ever. Lindsay looked at me, her eyes still tired, but now holding a glimmer of determination. I think we find out the truth. Whatever it takes. Lindsay's determination sparked something in me. I'd spent weeks drowning in guilt and paranoia, but now, the thought that Emily's death might have been more than a tragic accident gave me a new focus, something to cling to. We dove headfirst into finding out what really happened. Lindsay had access to some of Ben's old emails and texts, and I started digging into everything I could find: bank statements, police reports, anything that might give us a clue. The more we uncovered, the more it became clear. Ben had been in deep with some dangerous people. Gambling debts weren't just rumors. They were a fact, and they were big. The kind of debt that gets people killed. In one of his emails, Ben had mentioned a meeting with a guy named Sal, someone Lindsay recognized as a known loan shark. The pieces started falling into place. Ben wasn't just a cheater. He was a man running out of time, and Emily had been caught in his crosshairs. One night, Lindsay and I pieced together a timeline of the last few weeks before the crash. The closer it got to the night of the accident, the more erratic Ben's behavior became. Phone calls in the middle of the night, withdrawals from strange bank accounts, and meetings with people he wouldn't normally associate with. It was becoming clear that something had gone terribly wrong in his world, and Emily had been dragged along for the ride. "I think they were running," Lindsay said one evening, her voice low but certain. "They weren't just speeding for no reason. Ben was trying to get away from something, or someone." I nodded, feeling that same dark realization creep into my gut. The crash hadn't been a coincidence. It was starting to look like Ben had been trying to escape whatever debt collectors or dangerous contacts were after him, and Emily had been unfortunate enough to be by his side when everything came crashing down, literally. In the weeks that followed, our search for answers transformed into something else. Lindsay and I began spending more time together, not just combing through the past, but sharing our pain, our anger, and our grief. The odd bond we had formed over our mutual betrayal grew stronger, and slowly, we became each other's support system. We had both been blindsided, left to pick up the pieces of lies we thought we knew, only to find out they had been built on lies. What had started as a need for closure turned into something deeper. We weren't just victims anymore. Together, we were rebuilding. It wasn't romantic, not at first, but there was something comforting in the way we leaned on each other, two broken people trying to figure out how to move forward. One evening, after hours of talking about everything except Ben and Emily, Lindsay turned to me, her eyes soft. "Do you think we'll ever really get over it?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think maybe we can move past it." She smiled, a real, genuine smile. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. We could move past it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. A year after the crash, Lindsay and I were no longer defined by our pasts. We had moved away from the city and settled in a small coastal town, far from the cliffs that had once haunted me. Together, we opened a small business organizing hiking tours for tourists. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. The open trails and fresh air became our new beginning, a symbol of the freedom we had reclaimed from the ghosts of Ben and Emily. It wasn't easy. Some days were harder than others. There were still moments when I'd catch myself thinking about what could have been, about the life I'd once imagined with Emily. But those moments passed, and the more time I spent with Lindsay, the more I realized that the future we were building together was far better than the one I had lost. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer controlled us. Instead, they reminded us of how far we'd come, how much we'd survived. And in the end, that was enough. The lies, the betrayal, the pain, it had all led to this. A new life, a new chapter. One we were writing together, one step at a time.